Hi, continuing on natural theology and Thomas Aquinas. I think this is going to be a little bit shorter video, and it's going to set us up for, I have another video for you to look in from Aquinas 101 about the divine attributes. This is steps 2 and 3 of natural theology. So remember, there's 3 steps. The first step is a proof for God's existence, and then using what we learn about God there to start figuring out what God must be like. So as far as a summary, what we just did in the previous video, we talked about what it takes to learn about God, and we showed that it can't be done directly. It has to be achieved indirectly. So this fits with the typical view that God is not something in the universe, something that we know about. Okay. Notice the difference between this and the soul. Socrates at least believed that we could have direct knowledge of the soul if we get ourselves in the right situation that we can experience it. Well, that makes some sense. If we have a soul, it's in us, right? So it is part of this world, even if it is a spiritual thing. The difference between the soul and God is God is immanent, but not thought to be another thing in the universe. Okay, and then the third summary point, we looked at 5 paths. Remember, 5 ways, St. Thomas calls them, to see God's nature more clearly. Okay, so I said, yes, they're proofs, but that's not the function in the Summa. That might be, I don't believe in God. You might be caught up by these proofs. Wow, cool, I never even thought about that before. One of my friends in graduate school said he became a Christian because he read the proofs for God's existence and was convinced by them. Cool. But from a Christian point of view, who believes already God exists, they don't need a proof, but they do need better understanding. So again, that's my idea of paths, okay? So let's look a little bit at the next 2 steps. We need to keep in mind that God is both transcendent and immanent. Okay, so God is totally other than everything in the universe, but God is very deeply present within the universe. And we need to avoid 2 dangers. So one danger we can call anthropomorphism. So this is the idea of making God to be human, at least maybe a superhuman. Okay, the Greeks did this. Their gods were superhuman human beings. Okay, they were physical, they had powers, so they're kind of almost like our superheroes. Kind of an interesting point there. The Greeks had the Olympic gods, we have superheroes. Are we really much different than them? The other thing to avoid is obscurantism. And this is the idea of when you obscure something, you hide it. So you believe that God is so utterly different that he's even incomprehensible. We can't understand God. So Christianity tries to go between the 2 of them. God is not just a really great human, but God is not totally incomprehensible. Maybe you don't agree. That's something at least to think about as we work through here. Okay, I talked about 2 steps before. I talked about one step called removing or denying, another step called affirming. So the first step is to figure out what God isn't. And this gives us what have been called in the tradition negative names or negative attributes. We'll come to that just in a second. Then the second step is to talk about what God is. So talking about God isn't is focusing on what the being that appears in the arguments for God's existence. Okay, so what must an unmoved mover be like? Okay, and the affirmation way is, well, what good things exist that must also exist in God because he's the cause of them? Okay, so that's a little bit of a preview. Let's go through that just a little bit more, not too much involved. Again, I'm just trying to give you a sense here. Okay, so let's actually skip that. So this via remotionis, the way of denying. Here's a nice quote. Once it is grasped that something exists, that's what we did in the proofs for God's existence, it remains to be investigated how it exists, in order that what it is may be known. But because it's not possible for us to know what God is, but rather what God is not, we cannot consider how God exists, but rather how God does not exist. And so right away, we're thinking about what you might call reverential negativity. We can only know what God is not. But that still might get us pretty far. So we have to strip away creaturely thinking, which is a lot trickier than you think. But it does fit with this insight that God wouldn't be God if we could know him. Okay, knowledge exerts a kind of control that makes the being that we're knowing at least equal to us, maybe makes us a little bit better than them. And that really wouldn't be God. God is the being that's beyond all. Okay, so some of the things that God is not. Well, one of the things, God is not a body. How do we know that? Well, if God is an unmoved mover, God can't have a body, because any body can be moved. If God is a bodily being and he hasn't ever moved, then he's not an unmoved mover. He's just a mover that hasn't been moved yet. But anything can be kicked if you get a big enough boot. Okay? If God, it follows, secondly, God would have no beginning or end. Okay? Because if he has no body, he's outside of time. So there's eternal. It gets a little more complicated. God is not some type of thing. The video that we're going to watch is going to talk a little bit about this. God doesn't even have an essence. He has to be pure existence. And these are all, when you think about it, they sound like, eternal sounds like a word, but if you really think about it, eternal is not saying what God is, it's saying what God is not. God is not in time. Now, what does that mean to be not in time? I have no clue, because I've never lived outside of time, and I can't imagine what it would be like to be outside of time. Okay, so I can conclude logically that God's not in time, but I may not really know what that means. As far as the way of affirming, well, the basic principle here is, well, God is a cause, and if causes have to have a similarity to their effects, so God has to have some similarity to the good things that God creates. So if God creates wise creatures, good creatures, God has to be good in some way, okay? But his goodness would exist very differently in him. And this has a lot to do with the fact that God is simple. So some of the things that God is, and this becomes a tradition of saying God is identical to this. So we've already seen this. We saw this in Boethius. So God is love. God is goodness. That was a point that was raised in Book 3 of the Consolation. God is unity. Okay, and again, these were, we've looked at this before. So in one way, I'm kind of pulling things back that coming back over conversations we've had. God is justice. Okay, so that's just by way of a very brief introduction to this, maybe to whet your appetite, and maybe if you want to follow up on it more, you can look into it yourself. We'll finish this section with a video from Aquinas 101, and then I'll have a discussion question for you to talk about as I try to sort through this material. Thanks.